It begins with a silence so complete that it almost feels deliberate. A silence that lingers in the foundations of houses without owners, in courtyards without monuments, in roads that lead everywhere and nowhere at once. When the first archaeologists brushed away the soil here, they expected the familiar signs of power: a ruler's tomb, a fortress wall, the heavy stamp of a king's will carved into stone. Instead, the earth opened gently, as though revealing something it had protected for far too long, something that defied every rule written about early civilizations. What surfaced was order without domination, beauty without hierarchy, and structure without the shadow of a throne. The settlements unfolded like pages in a forgotten book. Streets aligned with care, homes arranged with quiet symmetry, communal spaces shaped as if the builders believed people belonged together, not beneath someone. The deeper the excavators dug, the stranger the truth became. There were no palaces, no chambers set aside for leaders, no burial grounds reserved for elites. Every grave looked much like the next. Every tool appeared crafted with the same patient hand. It was as though the entire population lived shoulder to shoulder, neither above nor below, woven into a single pattern, without knots of privilege. At night, researchers walked through the ruins and felt the weight of absence. Not an absence of people, those traces were everywhere, but an absence of authority so complete it was unsettling. Civilizations are supposed to leave evidence of command. Someone must direct the stones, the fields, the rituals, the seasons. Yet this place whispered something different, something older and more difficult to grasp. The air carried the impression of a world that organized itself without force, as if the idea of ruling had never occurred to them. The crafted objects added another layer to the puzzle. Pottery with deliberate shapes, tools sharpened with skill, ornaments created with patient repetition. Each discovery should have pointed towards specialized classes. Instead, everything reflected shared knowledge, shared effort, shared identity. The more uncovered, the clearer it became that no single hand had shaped the destiny of these people. They had built collectively, lived communally, and vanished without leaving behind the signature of a leader. The thought unsettles even seasoned historians. If no kings rose here, if no armies guarded these streets, if no nobles claimed the largest homes, how did this civilization endure for centuries? What invisible structure held them in place? What unseen rhythm guided so many individuals to act as one? Their world should not exist according to what we are taught, and yet it does, quietly, confidently, carved into the earth like a contradiction, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Imagine walking through these abandoned avenues as dusk settles. Shadows stretch across stone floors that once echoed with footsteps. The emptiness does not feel ruined. It feels intentional, almost serene. You sense the presence of a society that solved problems differently, that moved through life without leaning on authority or bending to command. A world where cooperation replaced control, and where the idea of ruling may have been as foreign as the idea of disappearing. And still, they did disappear. Not in war, not in smoke, simply in silence. That silence is the threshold of our story. It draws us forward, urging us to ask what force held these people together, if not power. Something shaped these cities. Something bound these communities. Something guided them through generations without raising a single throne. To understand that force, we must follow the lines of their world lines, drawn not by rulers, but by the land itself. The land that cradled this forgotten civilization stretches outward like an old memory, wide and quiet, holding stories beneath every blade of grass. Vast plains roll into slow-moving river valleys, their waters drifting through reeds that whisper in the wind. Wetlands shimmer under morning light, reflecting skies so pale they seem almost weightless. Beyond them, forests rise in layered greens, thick with the scent of moss and the hush of old trees. Gentle hills fold the horizon into soft curves, as if the earth itself exhaled and settled into a long, unbroken rest. Nothing about these landscapes announces power, yet something about them feels watchful, as though they once guided a people who listened far more closely than we do. As archaeologists studied where the settlements were placed, a pattern emerged, one so subtle that it revealed itself only when hundreds of miles were mapped together. Each community sat near life-giving water, fertile soil, and high ground that offered a view of the surrounding terrain. Yet what surprised researchers most was what the people chose not to build. There were no walls, no towers, no trenches carved in panic. Where other civilizations fortified themselves, This one remained open, as if the idea of invasion belonged to another world entirely. It is unsettling to walk through a site so exposed, yet feel no hint of fear in its design. The openness suggests confidence, perhaps even trust in the land itself. Walking through these sites today feels like entering a space designed with extraordinary patience. Interconnected towns stretch across the region like beads on a necklace, joined by paths that curve naturally with the land rather than cutting through it. Wide boulevards unfurl toward communal plazas, their stones warmed by centuries of sun and cooled by countless evenings. Domestic structures reveal careful planning rooms, arranged around courtyards that drew in wind, light, and the quiet comfort of shared life. Nothing here feels hurried, nothing feels built to impress or intimidate. Instead, everything whispers the same gentle truth. The builders cared more for harmony than for dominance. The atmosphere becomes most powerful in the abandoned courtyards. Wind moves through them with a voice that feels both familiar and strange, brushing against stone that still holds the warmth of forgotten families. Shadows lengthen across plazas at dusk, stretching like slow-moving tides. The absence of rulers becomes more tangible here. No statues raised in honor of any leader, no carved declarations of triumph. Instead, the emptiness speaks of intention. The people built places meant for gathering, not for glorifying. Their world feels shaped by countless hands working together, guided by rhythms older than politics. Even the geometry of the structures reflects harmony rather than dominance. Houses face each other in ways that suggest conversation, not command. Pathways slip between walls with the ease of water finding its course. Everything seems guided by cooperation with the land, not manipulation of it. In many civilizations, construction marks a victory over nature. Here, it feels like a partnership. Researchers noticed another pattern that deepened the mystery. When settlements were compared across vast distances, many shared the same proportions, the same angles of alignment, and the same understated elegance. It was as if each town remembered the same song and built its own verse in harmony. No single city imposed its image upon the others. Instead, each echoed a shared understanding that transcended borders. This raises a question that settles softly but firmly in the mind. How did thousands coordinate such consistency without leaders, without armies, without a ruling class to enforce design? The answer may lie in the land itself. The terrain shaped their choices, coaxing them into patterns that encouraged unity rather than division. Rivers, hills, and forests became quiet teachers, offering lessons in balance and cooperation. The harmony between land and settlement invites a different way of seeing civilization, not as something imposed on a place, but something grown from it. The ruins do not feel conquered. They feel rooted. The land was not reshaped to suit ambition. It was understood, listened to, honored. Yet landscapes can only explain so much. The ground may whisper clues, but it cannot speak of the hands that built these towns or the hearts that filled them. To uncover the greater truth, we must leave the hills and rivers behind for a moment and step closer to the people themselves. Their choices, silent yet deliberate, invite us deeper into the mystery, urging us to seek the human story behind the land's quiet guidance today. They lived in a world without thrones, yet nothing about their lives felt incomplete. Their homes stood in gentle rows, each one nearly the same size, shaped with the same steady hands, built with the same quiet pride. When archaeologists first mapped these structures, they searched for a district reserved for the powerful, a cluster of larger dwellings that would signal hierarchy. But the landscape refused to reveal such divisions. No home towered over the others. No doorway widened to display wealth. The city unfolded with a calm, balanced rhythm, as if the idea of claiming more than one needed had never taken root. Inside those homes, patterns repeated. The same number of rooms, the same kinds of hearths, the same well-worn steps leading into shared courtyards where families gathered at dusk. There were no signs of slaves, no heavy chains, no cramped quarters built for the subservient. Instead, every household held a similar assortment of tools and vessels, echoing a shared approach to work and life. It was the kind of equality that appears almost imaginary to modern eyes. Equality not enforced, but embodied. Daily life unfolds easily when imagined in this place. Artisans sat near open doorways, shaping tools from bone and stone, their motions patient and confident. Children played in plazas where sunlight drifted across flat stones like a slow tide. Women wove textiles beside neighbors, their conversations drifting gently through the air. Men tended fields or crafted ornaments, returning each evening with baskets of food to be cooked in the open. Elders gathered nearby, not to command, but to guide, passing down knowledge by repeating stories rather than issuing rules. Everything suggests a society built not on obedience, but on continuity. The communal storage buildings reveal even more. Large rooms filled with shared goods, grains, dried fruits, materials for repair stand near the center of each settlement. These structures show no signs of locks or privilege. They were designed for access, not restriction. The distribution of food appears even. Tools of exceptional craftsmanship are found in ordinary homes, not guarded away in elite repositories. It is as though the community treated resources as threads that tied everyone together, not bargaining chips to elevate a few. Yet the most startling discovery emerges from the earth itself. Bones unearthed in cemetery grounds reveal something unsettling. This place supported a population far larger than many early kingdoms that rose and fell through force. The density of life was immense, and still, the society remained steady. No evidence of civil conflict, no mass burial pits, no weapons forged for war. Historians find themselves repeating the same question. How did so many people live so closely without rulers to keep order? The bones whisper an answer, but refuse to say it plainly. Perhaps harmony came not from control, but from something more fundamental. As the narrator walks us through these traces of life, a subtle idea begins to form, one that contradicts centuries of assumptions about how humans organize themselves. Maybe strength does not always rise from power. Maybe the absence of hierarchy did not weaken them. Maybe it fortified them, like a structure built without a single point that could break under pressure. Here, cooperation was not a philosophy. It was survival. And because no one stood above the rest, no one carried the burden of being feared or obeyed, the community moved together because moving together was the only way to endure. The rhythm of their days still lingers in the ruins, in the soft curves of doorways touched by countless hands, in the worn stones that mark footpaths between homes, in the faint scorch marks where fires once burned to warm shared meals. These remnants speak not of domination, but of belonging, an old belonging that carried them through generations without crowns or titles. Understanding these people draws us further into the mystery. If they lived without rulers, what shaped the spaces they built? How did their cities grow so intricate, so coordinated, without a guiding voice? The answers lie in the stones ahead, waiting silently for us to follow. The first impression of their cities is one of effortless order, as though the landscape had simply decided to arrange itself into streets, plazas, and courtyards. Yet nothing here is accidental. When archaeologists traced the lines of the main avenues, they found them aligned with the slow turning of the heavens. Solstice sunrises poured light directly into central squares, while the winter stars marked pathways that guided travelers at night. These alignments were too precise to be coincidental, yet no master planner emerged from the soil. No monumental house claimed the role of architect. The design feels deliberate, but the hands behind it remain invisible. Water systems provide another clue to the sophistication hidden beneath the quiet surface of these cities. Canals branch like delicate veins, feeding communal reservoirs that fill and empty according to seasonal cycles. Channels redirect water to gardens when rains grow sparse, and release pressure when rivers swell. These systems behave almost like intuition carved into clay and stone. Instead of building fortifications, these people built resilience, letting water carry warnings of the changing year. The city listened to nature, rather than attempting to silence it. Homes cluster around open courtyards that breathe with the seasons. In summer, breezes sweep through shaded passages, cooling rooms without the need for complex engineering. In winter, sunlight slips into inner spaces, warming the stone. The effect is subtle but profound. A city comfortable with its climate, shaped with sensitivity rather than dominance. These courtyards also served as communal pockets, places where weaving, carving, storytelling, and preparation of food blended into the rhythm of everyday life. They remind us that architecture was not simply shelter, it was a framework for connection. Shared structures stand at the center of many settlements, their purposes hinted at by wear patterns on floors and the arrangement of surrounding paths. Some appear to have been gathering halls, others storage complexes, others open platforms for ceremonies that bound the community together. Each structure serves many, not one. The absence of private grandeur becomes striking. No large house breaks the harmony. No building rises in self-importance. The city feels like an organism, not a monument to individuals. But the true intrigue lies in what repeats. When researchers compared distant settlements, separated by miles of plains and forests, they found that buildings followed nearly identical proportions. Doorways shared the same height, rooms mirrored each other's shapes, courtyards held consistent ratios of length to width. Even the alignment of major streets followed the same celestial markers. It looked like the work of a centralized authority issuing standardized plans, yet every artifact insists the opposite. No archives of commands, no royal seals, no records of decrees. The unity came from culture, not order. One discovery deepened the mystery further. A consistent unit of measurement embedded in construction across the region. Stones were trimmed with a shared rhythm, timber lengths matched across cities, and foundations echoed the same intervals. Yet no rulers, rods, or inscribed tools have been uncovered. The measurement existed everywhere, but the enforcer existed nowhere. It is as if the people carried the standard in their minds, not their hands, passing it from generation to generation, through memory, tradition, and quiet repetition. Architecture became a form of collective remembrance. Standing in these ruins, the city begins to feel alive in its own way. Paths guide footsteps toward communal spaces, not private retreats. Walls form gentle boundaries that invite movement rather than restrict it. Courtyards open outward instead of closing inward. The city itself seems to encourage behavior that benefits the many. Without kings, it fosters harmony. Without commands, it shapes cooperation. The blueprint becomes a silent king, one that governs through structure, not force. As viewers absorb this idea, the ancient streets take on new meaning. The stones stop being remnants of vanished builders and begin acting as clues to a world that trusted design more than authority. The realization settles slowly. These cities did not require rulers because the architecture itself held the society together. Organization was built into the walls, encoded in the alignments, whispered through the steady repetition of familiar proportions. Yet buildings, no matter how revealing, can only tell part of the story. To understand the full mystery of this civilization, we must step inside these spaces and look at what the people left behind. Their objects, tools, and symbols hold secrets that deepen the enigma rather than dispel it. When archaeologists first lifted the pottery from the soil, they expected the usual variations that appear when countless hands work across vast distances. Yet the bowls, jars, and plates seemed to echo each other with uncanny precision. Shapes matched, thickness matched. Even the firing techniques appeared identical, as if every potter, no matter how distant, learned from the same quiet tradition. Tools told the same tale. Blades, grinders, scrapers, and weaving instruments showed a consistency that defied regional differences. It was not the signature of a dominant workshop supplying lesser towns. It was a shared knowledge flowing like water through an open world, settling wherever people lived. The most striking part was the absence of luxury. In most ancient cultures, wealth announces itself through material choices. Gold, rare stones, exotic dyes, items crafted for privilege alone. Here, no such divide exists. Ornaments are beautiful but simple. Decorations follow steady patterns rather than flamboyant flourishes. A necklace found in a small settlement looks no different from one found near a major plaza. The quality remains exquisitely even, as though the society agreed silently that beauty belonged to everyone, not to those who claimed higher status. The artifacts do not whisper of hierarchy. They echo a different value entirely. Equality woven through the fabric of daily life. Closer inspection of these objects reveals a second layer of mystery. Many pots and textiles carry etched or painted motifs, spirals unfolding like slow breaths, waves curling as if moved by ancient tides, crossed lines forming delicate intersections, and occasional animal forms captured in their simplest essence. These symbols repeat across great distances, suggesting a shared symbolic vocabulary. But the placement of these motifs complicates the story. They rarely appear inside homes. Instead, they decorate communal walls, public courtyards, storage buildings, and ceremonial platforms. It is as though symbolism belonged not to individuals but to the community as a whole, existing only where many eyes could see. Why would motifs meant for everyone avoid the intimacy of private space? Were they reminders of shared stories, moral guides, markers of time, or visual prayers? Their absence inside homes adds a quiet tension to the narrative. The people clearly valued these images, yet they kept them in places where life intersected, not where it retreated. It suggests that meaning was not something one claimed alone, but something carried together. Another curiosity deepens the mystery. Some tools and vessels show no signs of wear at all. Their edges remain sharp, their surfaces pristine, their shapes untouched by the demands of daily labor. These flawless objects appear across multiple sites, hinting that they were created for something beyond utility. Perhaps they played a role in rituals. Perhaps they marked transitions, seasons, or agreements. Yet this theory collides with another striking absence. No temples stand in these cities, no altars, no shrines, no sacred enclosures carved with elaborate scenes. The people appear deeply symbolic, yet they left no evidence of organized worship. Their rituals, if they existed, flowed through everyday life, rather than rising above it. This balance between creativity and humility becomes more mesmerizing with each discovery. Their objects show ingenuity, but no pride of ownership. Their symbols show shared meaning, but no sign of doctrinal control. Their standardization shows coordination, but no central authority. Everything contradicts the expectations shaped by other civilizations. Where kings carved victories, these people carved spirals. Where priests guarded sacred objects, these people placed symbols in open spaces. Where elites displayed wealth, these people shared beauty freely. Walking through museum rooms filled with artifacts from this world produces a strange sensation. Each item feels familiar, humble, and deeply intentional. They do not shout for attention. They invite contemplation. Together, they form a quiet map of a society that understood cohesion without hierarchy and expression without domination. One begins to sense that these objects were not merely tools or decorations. They were threads, stitching the society into something whole. Yet, as revealing as these artifacts are, they leave us standing at the threshold of a deeper mystery. Symbols can show how a culture sees the world, but they cannot explain how a people behaved when gathering under open skies, or what they believed when the seasons shifted. To answer that, we must step beyond the objects and into the rituals themselves. Rituals that unfold without temples, without priests, and without the structures that usually define belief. Across the remnants of this civilization, certain spaces stand apart from the rest, not as temples or sanctuaries, but as open expanses shaped for gathering. Stone platforms stretch beneath the sky, their edges softened by centuries of wind. Circular structures sit like quiet bowls carved into the earth, inviting voices to rise and fall within their curves. Nearby, communal hearths mark the spots where fires once burned through long nights, drawing people together in flickering warmth. At first glance, these places resemble ceremonial sites found across many ancient worlds. Yet the more they are studied, the stranger they become. There are no idols here, no altars stained by offerings, no carved gods demanding devotion. The stones hold no commandments. The platforms bear no images of divine triumph. Instead, what remains is openness, an architectural invitation for people to gather, not obey. Even the astronomical markers, positioned with astonishing precision, seem designed not to honor a deity, but to honor time itself. Solstice shadows align with certain stones, lunar cycles echo in the placement of carved depressions, and seasonal transitions appear woven into the very rhythm of the structures. These markers do not worship the sky. They follow it. Archaeologists found traces of gatherings, footprints in packed soil, remnants of food shared among many, fragments of instruments carved from bone and wood. Music echoed here once, soft and bright in the open air. Fire ceremonies likely unfolded across these platforms, flames rising as the people welcomed a new season or remembered an old one. Yet everything suggests that participation was communal, not controlled. No priest's house stands nearby. No sacred residence dominates the view. The ceremonies appear to have belonged to everyone equally. This absence of religious authority is not emptiness, it is a revelation. It proposes a worldview where spirituality did not rely on hierarchy, where meaning emerged from shared experience rather than dogma. The people seem to have woven ritual directly into the fabric of daily life. Songs sung during planting, dances performed at harvest, fire circles marking the turning of the year. Their ceremonies did not elevate a chosen few. They bound the many. The simplest acts, lighting a hearth, tracing a symbol, gathering at dusk, became expressions of connection. Such a worldview challenges the expectations historians often bring to ancient societies. We are accustomed to imagining early civilizations as built around powerful priests, elaborate myths, and rigid doctrines. Yet here stands a culture that found unity without those structures. Their rituals feel more like conversations with the natural world, conversations carried by the wind, the stars, the cycles of light and dark. Perhaps they saw the sacred, not in statues, but in seasons. Not in commands, but in continuity. As the narrator moves through these empty platforms, a quiet possibility emerges. Maybe they believed that time itself was the guiding force. The return of rains, the shifting constellations, the rise and fall of the sun, these might have shaped their sense of order more than any divine figure. Their spiritual life may have been less about worship and more about balance, a steady alignment with rhythms that required no temple to interpret. This idea unsettles modern assumptions about what binds a society together. If no priest directed their rituals and no ruler shaped their beliefs, what held them in unity for centuries? What invisible thread tied them across vast distances, allowing them to live, build, and celebrate in harmony? The question lingers like a soft echo across the abandoned platforms. Something deeper than ritual sustained them, something we have not yet uncovered, and as we leave these ceremonial spaces behind, another mystery rises to meet us. With no rulers and no priests guiding their world, what happened when their civilization began to fade? Across the wide region where this civilization once flourished, archaeologists noticed a pattern so unsettling it felt almost theatrical. Settlements separated by mountains, rivers, and forests all bear the same quiet signature. Sudden abandonment, not collapse, not destruction, abandonment. The difference is profound. These towns do not look like places torn apart by violence or swallowed by panic. They look like places where people paused, set down their tools, stepped outside, and simply never returned. Walk through one of these sites in the cool morning light, and the silence feels almost deliberate. Homes stand intact, walls show no signs of breach, doorways retain their shape, unbroken by force. Inside the houses, the floors remain swept, the storage vessels sealed, the sleeping platforms cleared of daily clutter. Tools rest in neat arrangements, as if waiting for hands that promise to return. Grinding stones hold the last traces of grain. Water vessels sit full. It is the tidiness that chills archaeologists most. Disorder marks fear. This is something else. Fire scars appear only rarely, and when they do, they are isolated, controlled, never spreading wildly through the settlement. There are no mass graves, no scattered bones, no signs of starvation, no bodies trapped beneath collapsed walls. The people did not die here. They left. And they left with such composure that the act feels rehearsed, almost ritualistic, as if the entire society had practiced how to step away from its homes when a certain moment arrived. The absence of violence becomes its own mystery. Every stone resists the idea of invasion. Defensive walls remain untouched. Avenues show no signs of fleeing crowds. Storage buildings retain their supplies, untouched by looters. Even animals appear to have been released or taken with the departing families, leaving no evidence of frantic escape. It is as though the towns drifted into emptiness, like candles extinguished one by one across a darkening plain. Researchers proposed explanations, each intriguing but incomplete. Migration seems plausible at first. Perhaps the people moved towards safer land or better resources. Yet, if they migrated, they left no trail of transitional camps, no scatter of belongings along the journey, no sudden density of population elsewhere. Environmental pressure is another candidate. Droughts, floods, or shifts in climate could have tested the resilience of the region. But earlier generations had weathered similar challenges without dissolving their communities. Why would this time be different? Famine is another theory. Yet storage pits hold untouched grain, and bone analysis reveals no sharp decline in nutrition. Disease? A possibility. But epidemics leave patterns. Burials hurriedly dug, households sealed in sorrow, medicine tools scattered in panic. None of these appear. The bones found later show steady health, not sudden collapse. Every path of explanation bends into the same impossible shape, a departure without fear, without force, without chaos. Walking through these abandoned plazas today, a strange presence lingers. Not the presence of the people who once lived here, but the presence of their absence. It rests in the way shadows fall across unused thresholds, in the way sunlight creeps into rooms that once held laughter, in the way silence deepens where conversations once echoed. It feels like a ghost story without ghosts, a riddle carved into the very air. What makes the mystery more haunting is the stability that preceded the disappearance. This civilization thrived for centuries. Its homes were consistent, its rituals steady, its cooperation resilient. Nothing in the archaeological record hints at rising conflict or social fracture. Everything suggests continuity, and then, suddenly, everything stops. The quietness of their departure magnifies the enigma. A people so deeply rooted in their land, so attuned to its rhythms, does not abandon it lightly. Something called them away, something powerful enough to move entire communities, yet subtle enough to leave no trace of struggle. The earth remembers the moment, but not the reason. Silence alone cannot explain what happened. To understand this vanishing, we must turn to the forces that shape their world, the shifts in climate, water, and sky that may have whispered the first warnings. Long before the settlements fell silent, the land beneath them began to change in ways too subtle for a single generation to notice. The clues lie buried in pollen trapped within ancient soils, in the fine grains of sediment that settled quietly at the bottoms of lakes, and in the shifting courses of rivers that once braided through fertile plains. Together, these fragments reveal a story of slow, steady environmental transformation. Nothing sudden, nothing catastrophic, but a shift significant enough to alter the way life unfolded across the region. Pollen samples show that plant species once abundant began to decline. Grasses gave way to hardier shrubs. Trees that thrived on regular rainfall grew sparser, replaced by species adapted to dryness. Layers of sediment deepen with traces of wind-blown dust, hinting at seasons when the soil grew loose and vulnerable. The rivers that sustained these communities began to meander unpredictably, abandoning old channels and carving new ones. This kind of instability disrupts the delicate balance that agricultural societies depend upon. Yet the people did not experience disaster in a single moment. The change was gradual, creeping across decades, perhaps centuries. Older residents may have noticed that rains felt less reliable, that harvests demanded more care, that once predictable cycles became increasingly uncertain. Younger generations may have assumed the shifting patterns were normal, the way children accept a new landscape without knowing what it replaced. Climate does not always announce itself with calamity. Sometimes it erodes quietly, altering the foundation of life, grain by grain. The narrator pauses here, inviting viewers to imagine the strain such changes place on a society dependent on harmony with nature. As water grew unreliable, the irrigation canals that once guided it so gracefully required constant adjustment. Fields that had produced abundant crops began to show uneven yields. Livestock needed new grazing routes. Even the timing of festivals tied to the seasons may have drifted out of alignment with the world they honored. But then a twist emerges, one that unsettles neat explanations. Despite environmental stress, their agricultural system was surprisingly resilient. Studies of ancient seeds, storage pits, and soil chemistry show that the people cultivated a diverse mix of crops, each adapted to different conditions. This diversity should have buffered them against climate fluctuations. Other civilizations, facing sharper environmental shifts, survived by adjusting their farming strategies. Yet here, a society with remarkable ecological wisdom dissolved entirely. This contradiction forms one of the most compelling mysteries. Climate change alone does not explain the disappearance. It acts instead like a whisper at the edge of the story, a warning that something was shifting, something that required attention, adaptation, or movement. The people may have sensed this long before it manifested in their fields. Perhaps the sky darkened in unfamiliar ways. Perhaps river paths grew unpredictable enough to unsettle old routines. Perhaps the land they trusted began to feel unfamiliar, as though a long partnership were fraying. Environmental change, then, becomes a trigger rather than a cause. It nudged the society toward a threshold where choices needed to be made. For a civilization built on balance rather than dominance, even small disruptions may have carried symbolic weight. A missed harvest might not threaten survival, but it could signal that the old rhythms no longer guided them reliably. A dried river channel could feel like a sign that the land they understood was transforming into something else. The world they had synchronized themselves with may have begun shifting to a tempo they could no longer follow. The narrator lingers on this thought. What if they interpreted these changes not simply as practical problems but as messages? In a society without rulers, where meaning was drawn from the environment itself, a subtle alteration in climate could have resonated like a call to reconsider their place. Not a command, but a suggestion. Not a threat, but a prompt. What if nature whispered a warning and the entire civilization obeyed? This explanation, however, is only the beginning. Environmental changes may explain why they looked outward, but not why they vanished so completely. Something else must have amplified that whisper into a collective decision, pushing them to leave behind the world they had shaped so carefully. And to find that missing piece, we must look toward forces that run deeper than weather or soil. Something else may have finished what the environment began. There is a theory that scholars hesitate to voice, not because it lacks evidence, but because it runs against the way we want ancient stories to end. We are comfortable blaming climate, invaders, or sudden catastrophe. We are less comfortable imagining that a civilization might dissolve quietly from within, not through violence, but through the slow unraveling of the very cooperation that held it together. And yet the archaeological record whispers hints of such a fading hints, subtle enough to overlook, but persistent enough to demand attention. As researchers mapped the final phases of these settlements, they noticed that craftsmanship began to decline. The tools that once showed exquisite skill grew slightly rougher. Pottery lost some of its symmetry. Decorative motifs became simpler, less certain, as if the stories behind them were no longer fully remembered. Buildings, too, began to shrink. Rooms that once opened into generous courtyards became smaller, their walls thinner, their layouts less precise. It was not collapse, but contraction, like a breath quietly drawn inward. Ceremonial spaces tell a similar story. In earlier centuries, gathering areas show heavy use. Trampled soil, ash from countless fires, marks from shared dances and rituals. But in later layers, those signs fade. The hearths grow cold, the footprints thin. Tools designed for music appear less frequently, as though gatherings continued but with fewer participants. Community life did not vanish overnight. It dimmed gradually, as if enthusiasm itself were draining from the world they had built. Then comes the detail that unsettles even the most cautious scholars. In several towns, signs of burning appear, but not the kind associated with raids or destruction. The fires are contained, controlled, selective. One building burns, while the one beside it remains untouched. Storage rooms show scorch marks on walls, but preserved grain inside. Doorways charred, yet rooftops uncollapsed. It is the mark of people who knew exactly what they were burning, and why. Not enemies erasing a city, but residents erasing traces of themselves. What drives a community to cleanse its own spaces? Was it symbolic, a ritual of ending, a controlled release of what no longer served them? Was it practical, a deliberate purging before departure? Or was it emotional, a way to break ties with a world they no longer trusted? These flames do not speak of terror, they speak of intention. The narrator lingers on this image. A village gathering at dusk, not to flee, but to let go. Flames rising quietly in the still air, shadows flickering across familiar walls. People standing shoulder to shoulder, knowing this ritual would mark a turning point. It is a scene haunting not for its violence, but for its composure. A society capable of such calm decisions would not abandon its world without reason. Yet the reason remains locked behind silence. Internal dissolution does not require conflict. It only requires doubt, a hesitation that spreads slowly through a community built on cooperation. If your world has no rulers, stability rests entirely on shared belief. Belief in each other, in rituals, in the land, in the rhythms that guided life for generations. What happens when that belief frays, when the seasons shift unpredictably, when symbols lose their clarity, when gatherings feel thinner, quieter, less certain? A society without hierarchy can be incredibly strong until the invisible threads holding it together begin to loosen. Imagine a song sung by many voices. At first, it fills the air effortlessly, but if a few voices falter, the harmony wavers. If enough drift away, the rhythm becomes fragile. Eventually, even those who remain struggle to recall the melody. The civilization may have reached such a moment when the shared understanding that once united them no longer held the same force. Not a collapse of stone, but a collapse of meaning. And so they may have walked away, not because they were pushed by enemies or broken by famine, but because they no longer believed in the world they had built. Their silence begins to look less like disappearance and more like a decision. This possibility leads us to the next stage of the story, a time when the world they left behind waited beneath soil and shadow for rediscovery. The story of this forgotten civilization begins not with grand discoveries, but with small, patient gestures, hands brushing soil from stone, trowels moving in quiet arcs beneath the heat of an early morning sun. The first archaeologists who arrived here expected the usual remnants of ancient power. A fortified town, perhaps, guarded by thick walls, a tomb belonging to a local ruler, signs of stratification carved directly into the layout of the settlement. Instead, they found open courtyards, communal rooms, and foundations that suggested harmony rather than hierarchy. The earth offered fragments reluctantly, as if deciding whether these newcomers were worthy of knowing what lay below. The earliest digs revealed structures that puzzled even seasoned researchers. Walls aligned with surprising precision, floors crafted from smooth stone rather than uneven clay, tools that seemed standardized across households. But the puzzle deepened quickly. No palace ruins emerged. No stronghold crowned the landscape. No elite burials appeared in the cemeteries. The archaeologists, accustomed to finding the machinery of authority stamped across every ancient culture, felt a quiet discomfort. The ruins refused to tell the story they expected. In those first few seasons, the team assumed they were excavating small, isolated villages, communities of modest scale, places where perhaps a handful of families worked the land and gathered in simple routines. Yet the craftsmanship contradicted the smallness. It felt too deliberate for a remote outpost, too consistent for a minor settlement. Still, the researchers held to their initial assumptions. The idea that something larger lay beneath the soil seemed almost implausible. Day after day, the work continued. Dust filled the air in soft clouds, as brushes revealed the edges of forgotten walls. Shards of pottery emerged in repeating shapes. Hearthstones appeared in familiar patterns. Trowels scraped through layers of time, each stroke exposing something that raised more questions than answers. The calm narrator reminds us, the earth does not rush to reveal its memories, and here that patience becomes a presence of its own, shaping the rhythm of discovery. It wasn't until survey teams expanded their search beyond the initial site that the truth began to unfold. A second settlement displayed the same layout. A third echoed the same proportions. A fourth revealed identical courtyards and nearly identical tool forms. The pattern stretched outward like a whisper moving through the land. What the archaeologists had thought were isolated villages were, in fact, pieces of a vast interconnected world. The realization came slowly, almost reluctantly. One evening, after mapping the data from several digs, a researcher spread the site plans across a table. When viewed side by side, the similarities could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The settlements formed a network, each one echoing the same architectural language, the same communal priorities, the same absence of centralized power. It was like discovering multiple chapters of a book scattered across a landscape and realizing they belonged to the same story. The atmosphere on the excavation grounds shifted. What began as a routine investigation grew into a mystery that challenged the foundations of archaeological expectation. How could so many settlements share such uniformity without a ruling force directing them? Why were there no markers of hierarchy, no symbols of command, no traces of leaders shaping the world around them? The researchers found themselves confronting the possibility that this civilization operated according to principles radically different from those of its contemporaries. And then the most important question rose from the dust. If these ruins were only fragments, how vast was the civilization they belonged to? How far did its influence stretch? How many towns lay hidden beneath centuries of soil, waiting for the quiet brush of a trowel to reveal their place in the puzzle? The first clues beneath the soil had only opened the door. As the evidence multiplied, the map of this forgotten world expanded beyond imagination, and with each new discovery, the mystery deepened, urging the archaeologists and us to look further. The turning point in this investigation came when archaeologists lifted their eyes from the trenches and began studying the land from above. Aerial photographs, taken first from low-flying planes and later from satellites, revealed something the excavators on the ground had not yet imagined. The patterns they were uncovering did not belong to isolated towns at all. They belonged to a network, one so vast and quiet that it seemed almost impossible that history had overlooked it. Settlement after settlement appeared in the imagery, each shaped with the same gentle precision, each echoing the same architectural rhythm. From the sky, the landscape transformed into a tapestry of faint geometric outlines. Rectangular plazas caught light differently than surrounding soil. Subtle depressions traced the paths of ancient streets. Water channels ran like thin veins across the plains. Though time had softened their edges, the structures remained visible enough for trained eyes to detect. The more images researchers studied, the more the pattern expanded. Points on the map multiplied until they filled entire valleys and crept into foothills, forming a constellation across the land, an invisible nation hiding in plain sight. Yet this growing constellation held a strange silence at its center. No structure resembling a capital appeared. No complex of buildings suggested an administrative core. There was no grand palace surrounded by elite residences, no central temple towering above others. The settlements were similar in size, in shape, and in intention. Power did not radiate from a single point. Instead, the land seemed to hum with equality, each community a star of equal brightness within a sprawling galaxy of human presence. Ground surveys confirmed what the photographs hinted. The repeated layouts were deliberate. Homes aligned with the same celestial markers. Plazas matched in proportion. Communal storage buildings mirrored one another across immense distances. In some regions, the pathways connecting settlements curved gently along rivers. In others, they followed ridgelines that offered safe passage in rainy seasons. The roads wove a network that spoke not of conquest, but of connection. Connection maintained without armies, without overseers, without commands etched into stone. The midsection revelation comes quietly, but reshapes the story entirely. When researchers overlaid environmental data onto the settlement map, they discovered that the distribution of towns mirrored seasonal resource patterns. Areas rich in game during winter had winter-occupied settlements. Regions fertile in summer hosted summer communities. Water sources shifted with the seasons, and the people moved with them, not chaotically, but with precision. This civilization appears to have coordinated movement, storage, and labor over hundreds of kilometers, all without central authority. How do thousands of people across such vast distances synchronize their lives without leaders directing them? How do pathways join seamlessly between settlements, built generations apart? The scale defies assumptions. This culture behaved like an organism whose parts communicated, not through commands, but through shared understanding passed across time. The narrator's voice settles into a meditative calm, encouraging viewers to imagine the land as it once was, alive with footpaths, voices, and gatherings. Communities exchanging goods and stories along routes shaped by the seasons. Families moving between settlements for harvest festivals. Craftsmen teaching techniques carried across generations and geography. It was a civilization that grew wide instead of tall, interconnected instead of centralized, guided not by the will of rulers, but by the cycles of nature. As the satellite imagery stitched the ancient world together, a quiet astonishment rippled through academic circles. How could a system so vast, so coordinated, so elegantly structured, remain absent from historical records? Why did no chronicler mention a people who organized themselves across such expansive territory? The answer was uncomfortable. Historians had been trained to look for the signatures of power capitals, palaces, armies, and this civilization left none. Its very success made it hard to see. Standing before the full map, one realizes how incomplete our definition of civilization has been. We measure complexity by hierarchy. We measure greatness by conquest. But here was a society that achieved both scale and stability without either. Its coordination challenges the foundations of historical thought, whispering that human ingenuity does not always seek crowns or thrones. And once the map was drawn, a new question emerged, subtle but insistent. Who were these people compared to the neighbors who surrounded them? As researchers broadened their investigations beyond the borders of this silent civilization, they turned their attention to the cultures that surrounded it, societies shaped by kings, warriors, and elaborate hierarchies. These neighboring groups carved their histories in stone, inscribed them on pottery, and recorded them on early forms of writing. Their rulers celebrated victories, catalogued tributes, and marked the rise of dynasties. Yet in all their records, in all their symbols of pride and power, there is no mention of a vast, peaceful, leaderless civilization thriving alongside them. The omission feels impossible, almost eerie, as though an entire world had existed beside these kingdoms without attracting attention or fear. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, threading through mountains, forests, and plains. Goods travelled far. Polished stones from distant quarries, woven textiles dyed with local plants, ornaments shaped in styles that traversed boundaries. Ideas moved just as persistently. Pottery techniques echoed across cultures. Agricultural strategies shifted from one community to the next. Yet something remained unmistakably distinct about this civilization's artifacts. While neighboring societies left behind objects that reflected rank and wealth, every tool and ornament from this peaceful world followed a quiet, egalitarian logic. The contrast becomes even sharper when examining how other cultures express power. Kings elevated themselves through monumental architecture. Warriors displayed their status through weapons and armor. Priests adorned temples with scenes of cosmic order. But the cities we are exploring resist such signatures. No victory steles proclaim dominance. No ritual complexes elevate one class above another. Even their trade goods, though well-crafted, show no indication that certain families controlled more than others. Their world, viewed through the lens of comparison, becomes more puzzling, not less. Midway through the ongoing research, genetic studies introduced a revelation that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Human remains from various settlements revealed remarkable genetic diversity, far greater than expected for a civilization without documented expansion or conquest. This diversity suggests that people from faraway regions joined their communities, whether through marriage, adoption, or migration. Outsiders became insiders. Yet, even with this influx of varied ancestry, no elite biological line appears. No family rose above the rest. The society absorbed diversity without forming hierarchy, maintaining equilibrium where others would have created distinction. This discovery unsettles long-standing assumptions about how ancient cultures maintain stability. Most societies use hierarchy to organize newcomers, granting privileges to some and relegating others to lower roles. Here, none of that emerged. Instead, diversity appears to have enriched the cooperative structure rather than disrupted it. It challenges the idea that stratification is inevitable. It suggests that this civilization held a worldview strong enough to integrate difference without fracturing. As the narrator guides us through this comparison, a striking image forms. Neighboring kingdoms rose through conquest and fell the same way. They built walls, raised armies, taxed their populations, and carved their triumphs into stone. Their histories roar with conflict. In contrast, this silent civilization expanded gently, connected by pathways of shared knowledge, not force. It avoided the pendulum of dominance and defeat, and when it vanished, it did so without battle cries, without ruins smouldering from war, without even a whisper left in the chronicles of those who lived beside it. That absence is haunting. How can an entire civilization stand beside powerful neighbors, visible, intricate, expansive, yet remain unrecorded, unfeared, and seemingly unnoticed? Did the neighbors overlook them, or did their peaceful nature make them invisible to societies obsessed with hierarchy and conquest? Perhaps cultures that value dominance fail to perceive worlds that thrive without it. The comparison deepens the core enigma. This civilization did not just defy modern assumptions, it confounded the understanding of those who lived alongside it. Even contemporaries could not interpret a society that grew strong without kings, survived centuries without armies, and dissolved without leaving a trace of struggle. And so, to understand them more completely, researchers turned away from external comparisons and back toward the people themselves, their bodies, diets, and health-seeking clues written not in records or ruins, but in the quiet testimony of bone and breath. The bones came first in fragments, lifted from the soil with brushes and gloved hands, each piece carrying quiet testimony from a world long gone. In most ancient societies, skeletons reveal a familiar story. Cracked ribs from skirmishes, blades that bit into bone, arrowheads lodged in joints, and fractures poorly healed after accidents or violence. But these remains told a different tale. As forensic teams examined the bones laid out under the soft glow of lab lights, they noticed an absence more striking than any presence. There were almost no signs of warfare. Arms and legs showed the stress of physical labor. Yes, tendons strained by routine work, muscle attachments thickened by daily movement, but the cuts and breaks associated with battle were rare. The skulls lacked the sharp depressions that come from clubs or stones. Ribs showed no evidence of forced trauma. Only a handful of skeletons bore injuries consistent with violence, and even those appeared isolated, not systematic. For a civilization that thrived for centuries, this level of peace borders on the unbelievable. As the narrator guides viewers through the reconstructions, slow 3D models rotate to reveal bone surfaces smoothed by time. The people lived demanding lives, moving soil, shaping tools, gathering harvests, walking long paths between settlements. Their bodies reflect that endurance. But they do not reflect conflict. Evidence of interpersonal violence, broken noses, defensive wounds on arms, deep cuts on bone, is so rare that it forces a reconsideration of what life in early civilizations might have been. These were not communities hardened by war. They were communities shaped by something gentler. The forensic teams widened their inquiry, examining samples from children, adults, and elders. The results revealed another quiet revelation. Nutritional markers, lines in enamel, growth patterns in long bones, densities in vertebrae were strikingly consistent across ages. Children did not show signs of chronic malnutrition. Elders retained enough bone mass to suggest steady access to food. This uniformity contrasts sharply with societies structured by hierarchy, where elites often enjoy richer diets while lower classes suffer scarcity. Here, nourishment seemed shared rather than stratified. Even in burials, the pattern held firm. Graves do not display the disparities expected in pre-modern worlds. Individuals were laid to rest with similar care, accompanied by similar objects wrapped in similar materials. No lavish tomb rises above the rest. No grave suggests the presence of a ruling class with privileged access to resources. Every person appears woven into the same social fabric, nourished by the same fields, protected by the same stability. This balance illuminates a deeper possibility. Without kings to direct labor, without armies to impose order, how did such peace prevail? The answer may lie in cooperation, not as an ideal, but as a practical foundation of life. When communities depend on each other for survival, when fields require collective maintenance, and rituals demand shared participation, conflict threatens not just individuals but the entire system. Perhaps they learned, through generations of experience, that harmony offered better returns than domination. The narrator speaks softly, almost reverently, as the camera lingers over the bones. These remains carry stories long after voices fade, and the story they tell is not one of conquest or fear. It is one of endurance without violence, work without oppression, growth without war. It suggests a worldview in which conflict was neither glorified nor foundational. In a world where kings forged identities through battle, this civilization forged identity through balance. Yet this peaceful portrait raises its own questions. How did they manage disputes? How did they share resources without hierarchy? How did they maintain order across such a wide territory? The bones do not answer these mysteries directly, but they offer a powerful clue. Violence was not the mechanism. Whatever held this society together, it operated through different means, perhaps through shared customs, shared ancestry, or shared rituals that bound communities without coercion. The gently unsettling part is what the bones do not show. No signs of defensive injuries, no mass casualty layers, no abrupt shifts in health markers over time. It is as if generations flowed without the disruptions caused by war or famine. This continuity evokes admiration, but also curiosity. What kind of social structure supports such stability? If food and safety were shared so evenly, the next question becomes essential. What exactly did they eat, and how did they manage the resources that sustained their harmony? Food often tells the truest story of a civilization, revealing not only how people survived, but how they understood their place in the world. When researchers examined isotopic signatures in the bones of this peaceful society, a picture of remarkable balance emerged. These people ate widely, drawing nourishment from river, field, forest, and meadow. Their diet was not anchored to a single crop, nor dominated by a single method of production. Instead, it resembled a tapestry woven from many threads, each one strengthening the whole. Plant remains recovered from ancient hearths show grains of several varieties, hardy cereals suited for dry seasons, softer grains that thrived when rains were generous, and tubers cultivated in soil kept rich by careful rotation. Edible greens, nuts, fruits, and legumes appear in layers of habitation floors, suggesting abundant gathering of wild plants alongside deliberate agriculture. Seeds from distant regions imply trade or seasonal travel. Such diversity protected these people from famine. When one crop failed, others filled the gap. When weather shifted, their systems shifted with it, not collapsing under the weight of dependence. Fishing played an equally important role. Bones of river fish and freshwater shellfish appear regularly in household refuse. Waterways were not simply sources of hydration, they were dependable providers of food. Forest remains paint a parallel story. Deer, small mammals and birds supplemented their meals. Each one hunted with precision that avoided overuse. The absence of slaughter pits or mass hunting sites suggests sustainable practices, grounded not in domination over nature, but cooperation with it. What astonished archaeologists most was not the variety, but the uniformity of access. In many ancient cultures, elite families enjoyed richer meals, while ordinary households survived on monotonous staples. Here, isotopic analysis shows no such divide. Children from different settlements absorbed similar nutrients. Adults, regardless of region, show comparable protein levels. Elders reveal signs of steady nourishment late into life. No evidence of elite feasting appears, no massive food dumps at ceremonial sites, no oversized storage vessels belonging to particular families. This society shared what it had, not as charity, but as habit. The narrator invites viewers to imagine twilight scenes within these settlements. Fires flicker in open courtyards. Clay pots simmer with stews rich in herbs gathered from nearby hills. Families sit in loose circles, exchanging food across simple wooden bowls. Children carry small portions to neighbors. Smoke drifts upward, carrying the scent of roasted grain and river fish. Mealtime feels less like a private event, and more like a ritual of connection, reaffirming bonds that required no ruler to enforce them. Seasonal festivals deepen this image. Archaeological traces, extra hearths built temporarily, clusters of cooking stones, piles of cracked nutshells suggest days of communal preparation when abundance was shared rather than hoarded. Instead of sacrifice or tribute, these gatherings celebrated rhythm, planting, harvest, migration of birds, return of rains. The people honored the cycles that sustained them, not through grand temples, but through the act of feeding one another. This dietary diversity mirrors the social structure uncovered in earlier chapters. A society that eats many foods becomes resilient, adaptable, and patient. A society that shares those foods becomes balanced. Their meals reveal a worldview in which survival was a collective responsibility, not the privilege of the powerful. As researchers mapped dietary patterns across centuries, they noticed that even during periods of environmental stress, the people maintained a surprising level of stability. While drought strained neighboring kingdoms and caused grain shortages that toppled dynasties, this civilization cushioned itself through variety. The simplest choices, what to plant, what to gather, what to fish, became subtle acts of preservation. By refusing to rely on a single crop, they avoided the fragility that plagued empires. By refusing to rely on a single ruling class, they avoided the divisions that often tore societies apart. What if their endurance came from this very refusal? What if the quiet wisdom of diversity allowed them to flourish where others faltered? Knowing what they ate reveals how they lived. And now, with food understood, the next mystery beckons. How did such a balanced diet shape the health of a people who seemed to thrive without hierarchy? Health, like architecture and ritual, reveals the inner logic of a civilization. When researchers examined the bones of this peaceful society, they uncovered evidence of lives that were unexpectedly long for their era. Joints showed steady use, but not the crippling strain seen in societies with punishing labor demands. Teeth bore the marks of varied, nutritious diets, rather than the deep grooves of persistent hunger. Even signs of chronic disease were surprisingly rare. The people seemed to carry themselves through life with a steadiness that spoke of balance rather than hardship. What puzzled archaeologists most was not the presence of health, but the absence of a medical elite. In many ancient cultures, healers occupied special roles: priestly physicians, herbal specialists, bone setters whose knowledge elevated them above ordinary people. But here, no such class emerges. No specialized tools appear in burials. No buildings hint at healing centers. No grave goods suggest a person was honored for curing others. Despite this, the population thrived. Their well-being appears to have risen not from centralized medical authority, but from the rhythms of their daily lives. The narrator guides viewers into this subtle truth with gentle pacing. Health was woven into their habits, movement through fields and forests, diets rich in variety, communal cooperation that reduced stress and spread resources evenly. Children, adults, and elders share similar nutritional markers, suggesting that no group suffered neglect. The elderly lived long enough to show signs of age-related wear, yet many retained bone density indicative of steady nourishment. Women's remains show fewer complications from childbirth than often expected in ancient populations. Even healed fractures display proper alignment, implying that ordinary people knew how to care for injuries effectively without relying on a specialist's intervention. Midway through the investigation, a quiet revelation surfaced. In several burials, faint residues of herbs were detected on the wrapping materials surrounding bodies. Chemical analysis revealed compounds consistent with medicinal plants still used today for pain relief, fevers, and digestive issues. These burials were not exceptional. They appeared across different settlements, across a wide span of time. Such consistency points not to a class of professional healers, but to a shared cultural practice. Knowledge of medicinal plants seems to have flowed through families, passed from elders to children by memory and example. This pattern suggests that healing was not an occupation, it was a communal inheritance. Everyone knew enough to care for themselves and their neighbors. Remedies existed not as privileged secrets, but as shared understandings of the land and its gifts. In a society where cooperation formed the backbone of survival, health became another space where responsibility was distributed rather than centralized. The narrator reflects on how this challenges assumptions about early civilizations. We often imagine progress arising from specialization, scientists discovering cures, priests blessing healers, rulers funding medical expertise. Yet here, the absence of hierarchy did not hinder well-being. It may have strengthened it. Without a medical elite controlling knowledge, healing became accessible to all. Without social divisions restricting care, treatment became universal. Their model feels strangely modern in its inclusiveness, yet profoundly ancient in its simplicity. This gentle picture of communal health raises deeper questions about how such a society maintained harmony. In a world without rulers, shared knowledge becomes a binding force. Health practices may have acted as threads that kept communities connected, reinforcing trust and interdependence. When everyone contributes to the well-being of others, a society can avoid many of the fractures that plague hierarchical systems. As the camera lingers over the reconstructed faces of individuals who lived thousands of years ago, the mystery deepens. How did a civilization achieve such steady health without doctors, priests, or rulers to guide them? What worldview allowed them to thrive through shared wisdom rather than authority? Their bones suggest a quiet mastery of balance, a way of life attuned to nature and community rather than power. Now that we have glimpsed how the people lived and cared for one another, the next step draws us closer to the heart of their culture. To understand their identity, we must turn to their symbols, their stories, and the beliefs that shaped their view of the world. Before written alphabets carved meaning into clay and ink, this civilization spoke through shapes, through lines, through quiet repetitions, etched into objects that still shimmer with intention. Archaeologists found no tablets, no scrolls, no markings that resemble a formal script. Instead, they uncovered a vocabulary made of spirals curling like slow winds, waves stretching across pottery as if echoing distant rivers, stepped forms rising like miniature mountains, and animal silhouettes simplified into elegant gestures. Celestial motifs appear frequently: circles, crescents, clusters of dots, suggesting that the sky itself served as a companion in their expression. The narrator guides us through shelves of reconstructed artifacts. Each symbol appears familiar, and yet its meaning remains elusive. Early researchers assumed these were decorative flourishes, mere adornments, but when the same shapes arose repeatedly across vast regions, the interpretation shifted. These symbols behaved like shared references, a visual vocabulary carried from settlement to settlement, generation to generation. They were too consistent to be random, too widespread to belong to individual artisans alone. They hint at seasons marked with care, journeys ritually remembered, values encoded without the confinement of text. The strongest revelation comes from their placement. Symbols adorn communal walls, ceremonial platforms, public storage buildings, and open gathering areas. They appear where many eyes could see, where gatherings likely unfolded, where rituals breathed life into shared experiences. Yet inside private homes, the symbols vanish. Pottery used for cooking and storage remains undecorated. Interior walls contain no imagery. Domestic objects stay functional, quiet, unmarked by the collective language. This boundary between private and public reveals something profound. Their worldview did not belong to individuals, it belonged to everyone at once. Imagine stepping into a plaza at dusk. Fires glow in a circle. People gather slowly, forming a living pattern in the open air. As music begins, perhaps flutes carved from bone, drums shaped from stretched hide, the cymbals take on purpose. Spirals painted on raised platforms catch the firelight, swirling as the shadows move. Stepped forms reflect the echo of feet tracing ancient choreographies. Animal silhouettes flicker as people dance around the flames. The shapes do not exist on objects alone. They animate through motion, sound, and shared breath. Their meaning becomes experiential. It is felt rather than read. This leads to a quiet question. What if their language was never meant to be captured in written form? What if it lived in movement, in the rising and falling of voices during festivals, in the alignment of bodies during ceremonies, in the shared gestures repeated across centuries? A ritual step may have said more than a sentence. A placement of stones on a ceremonial platform may have conveyed time, gratitude, or cosmic alignment. Their communication may have been inseparable from action. Some symbols appear linked to natural cycles. Spirals evoke the turning of seasons, the winding of rivers, or the continuity of life. Waves hint at water's essential role in their world, neither feared nor worshipped, but recognized as a rhythm that shaped their days. Animal shapes might represent communal traits admired or invoked during gatherings. Celestial motifs point toward a cosmology where stars served as storytellers, offering guidance without the rigidity of written commandments. The narrator points out how different this is from later civilizations. While others sought permanence through writing, this society embraced ephemerality. Their symbols lived through festivals that lasted an evening, through songs that flowed like water, through dances that replicated ancient stories without needing a single carved sentence. Their language could not be captured easily by archaeologists, because it was never meant to be frozen in time. It existed in continuity, not permanence. This symbolic world reinforces the idea of a society guided by shared identity, rather than individual prominence. No symbols sign a person's rank. No imagery glorifies a ruler. Everything points toward collective meaning patterns, shaped not by ego, but by belonging. For them, the universe may not have been a puzzle to decipher, but a rhythm to join. And so, the symbols become mirrors. They reflect a worldview where expression was communal, where meaning flowed outward into the open air, rather than inward into private memory. Their silence invites interpretation, yet their presence suggests a fullness that words cannot hold. Understanding these symbols brings us closer to their inner life. But symbols alone cannot reveal how individuals understood themselves within the collective. To uncover that, we must explore the ways they shaped identity through masks, music, and movement expressions carried not in script, but in the human body. When archaeologists unearthed the ceremonial artifacts of this civilization, they found objects that felt alive even in stillness. Masks fashioned from clay, plant fibers, bark, and pigments lay carefully buried in layers of time. Some were strikingly simple, shaped with just enough definition to hint at human features. Others displayed abstract lines, swirling motifs, or exaggerated expressions meant to distort the face beneath. Alongside these masks rested flutes carved from bone, rattles filled with seeds, drums stretched with hides, and garments adorned with patterned strips of woven cloth. It was clear that sound and movement played essential roles in their rituals. Yet these items carried a surprising message. None of the masks signaled superiority. No golden adornments marked a dominant figure. No elaborate crest distinguished a leader from participants. In societies ruled by kings or priests, ritual attire often mirrors power. Ornate headpieces, intricate robes, colors restricted to elite classes. Here, the artifacts lacked that hierarchy. Every object appeared designed for communal use. Their meanings flowed outward, shared, not claimed by individuals. Reconstructed scenes help the narrator bring these discoveries to life. As twilight settles over a ceremonial platform, villagers gather in a widening circle. Firelight catches the edges of their clay masks, turning them into shifting silhouettes. Drums pulse in steady rhythms, Rattles shimmer with soft, grain-like sound, and flutes release long notes that rise into the cooling air. People of all ages join the dance. Children mimic the steps of elders. Adults move in deliberate patterns honed by practice. As bodies sway in unison, the masks become more than decoration. They dissolve individuality, allowing each person to step into a shared identity, shaped by season, ritual, or community role. The diversity of mask styles offers another layer of intrigue. Some resemble animals, some appear geometric, some playful, others solemn. Yet none appear linked to status. A villager might wear a mask one year and a different mask the next, depending on the ritual's purpose or the symbolic needs of the gathering. Identity was fluid here, not bound to birth or wealth. It could shift with festivals, with stories retold around fires, with tasks performed for the collective. The mask became a tool not for hiding, but for transforming an invitation to enter roles larger than oneself. This fluidity challenges assumptions about ancient societies. In many cultures, rituals reinforce hierarchy, reminding participants of their place in a rigid structure. But here, rituals appear to dissolve those boundaries. When everyone dons a mask, everyone becomes equal. When music leads the steps, no single voice commands the rhythm. Participation becomes the measure of belonging, not rank. This suggests that identity was not something individuals clung to, but something they stepped into and out of as their community required. The narrator reflects softly. In a world without rulers, who are you? The answer, hinted at by these artifacts, is both simple and profound. You are the role you play in the moment. You are part of the gathering, the season, the ritual. You are shaped by the masks you wear, the steps you follow, the music that carries you. And when the dance ends, you return to yourself changed slightly, connected more deeply, reminded of the unity that underpins the society. Such a worldview leaves little space for ego. When identity flows like water between forms, no one rises above others. Instead, people inhabit roles temporarily, understanding that the ceremony belongs to everyone. This fluid identity mirrors the egalitarian structure seen in their homes, tools, and diets. It explains how they maintained harmony without hierarchy. Rituals were not imposed. They were lived. The artifacts show us a people who express themselves through art not as individuals seeking recognition, but as participants in a larger story. Masks, music, and dance allowed them to inhabit symbolic worlds where community overshadowed self, where movement shaped meaning, where identity pulsed with the rhythm of shared existence. If their understanding of themselves was so deeply tied to community, then their connection to the natural world must have been equally profound. To understand that bond, we must look beyond the masks and into the landscapes that shaped their beliefs. Long before calendars were carved into stone or priests charted the heavens from tall towers, this civilization learned its lessons from the world that surrounded them. Every settlement unearthed reveals traces of the quiet dialogue they kept with nature. Animal remains show seasonal hunting, never excess. Plant residues map cycles of planting and gathering that match rainfall patterns with remarkable accuracy. Water systems, built with gentle precision, rise and fall with the rhythms of nearby rivers, guiding communities through dry periods and floods without the need for rulers issuing commands. Everything they created seems to echo an understanding that life moves in patterns, and stability comes from listening to them. The narrator leads viewers along reconstructed landscapes where fields sit beside streams, shaped not by force but by patience. Houses cluster around courtyards, aligned with winds that cool them at summer's height. Pathways follow ridgelines that remain safe during the wet season. Nothing feels accidental. Their world was choreographed by seasons, not kings. Nature offered structure, and they answered with cooperation. Animal bones found in refuse pits reveal hunting tied to migration routes, not year-round pursuit. Fish remains appear predominantly in certain layers, suggesting communal gatherings timed to spawning cycles. Seeds from wild plants show up only in intervals that match natural blooming periods. These patterns indicate not extraction, but relationship, a shared rhythm that allowed food sources to replenish. Such harmony reduced conflict. When nature dictates time, communities share responsibility rather than compete for dominance. But the most striking revelation emerges from the sky. Across multiple settlements, some hundreds of kilometers apart, archaeologists discovered stones, posts, or carved markers aligned with the same solstice sunrise. No matter the region, the alignment remains nearly identical. It is as if the people reached upward toward the sun, with one mind, marking a moment when the world paused and turned again. This shared timekeeping system suggests a collective cosmology, a unified understanding of beginnings, endings, and renewal. The narrator reflects softly, "Kings create order for their people, but here order already existed." These alignments reveal something deeper than practical timekeeping. They hint at a worldview where authority belonged not to leaders but to cycles, sunrise and sunset, dry season and wet season, planting and harvest, migration and return. Continuity replaced command. Patterns replaced hierarchy. In this worldview, individuals mattered less than the role they played in the ongoing cycles. A person planting seeds one year might lead a dance the next. A hunter in one season might tend to water channels in another. Their identity was shaped by time, not entitlement. Fluid roles made rigid authority unnecessary. When the world itself provides direction, leadership becomes a shared task. Even their city planning reflects this philosophy. The orientation of homes, courtyards, and communal spaces flows with sunlight and prevailing winds. Streets widen where shadows fall, offering relief during the hottest months. Storage buildings sit on higher ground where rivers never reach. These choices reveal a mind tuned not to domination of the landscape, but to partnership with it. The narrator invites us to imagine their festivals. Circles of fire marking the longest night. Songs rising toward stars that signaled the coming rains. Dances mimicking the movements of animals, whose patterns guided survival. Through these rituals, nature became teacher, calendar, compass, and sacred story. No scripture needed to define it. No monarch needed to enforce it. The land itself held authority. Such a worldview feels peaceful, yet profound. It suggests that the stability of their civilization sprang not from hierarchy, but from alignment with sky, earth, water, and time. When people believe the universe speaks through cycles, obedience shifts from rulers to rhythms. And when everyone listens to the same rhythms, unity follows effortlessly. But understanding their relationship with nature brings us back to the greatest contradiction. If they were so attuned to the world, so rooted in cycles, why did they abandon everything when those cycles shifted? What force could pull an entire civilization away from the harmony it once trusted? To answer that question, we must return to the moment of their disappearance and search for meaning in the silence they left behind. Collapse is often imagined as a single moment, a sudden blow, a catastrophic event, a night when the world changes forever. But the story of this civilization is not a story of instant ruin. It is a story of fading, a dimming that happened so gradually that those living through it may not have realized what they were losing until it was already gone. Archaeological traces reveal this slow unraveling with quiet clarity. Buildings, once carefully constructed with standardized proportions, began shrinking. Walls grew thinner, floors simpler, foundations less precise. It was not neglect, but a soft retreat from the craftsmanship that once defined their world. Communal plazas tell an even more poignant story. Layers of trampled earth, evidence of gatherings, festivals, and rituals begin to thin. Hearths used for ceremonies are rebuilt less frequently, then abandoned altogether. Tools associated with music and dance appear in decreasing numbers across later strata. What was once a vibrant center of communal life gradually became empty space, a silence settling where songs once rose. Participation in the rituals that held their society together appears to have waned, generation by generation. Long-distance exchanges also declined. Earlier centuries reveal the movement of distinctive stones, shells, pigments, and crafted objects across great distances, linking settlements into a wide network. But in the civilization's final centuries, such materials become scarce. Trade routes that once buzzed with shared culture and communication grew quiet. People still traveled, but the flow of ideas and goods was no longer consistent. Connections frayed, not abruptly, but gently, like a web loosening strand by strand. Toolmaking followed the same pattern. Implements that once displayed consistent design across settlements began showing regional differences. Shapes simplified, ornamentation faded, standardization, which had once served as an invisible thread binding their world together, loosened. The diversity itself was not harmful, but the loss of shared identity implied by these changes hints at something deeper. The erosion of the collective spirit that made coordination possible. The narrator's voice softens, steady as dusk, to guide viewers through the emotional weight of these findings. A civilization built entirely on cooperation cannot sustain itself when cooperation weakens. There were no kings to enforce unity, no armies to impose order, no bureaucrats to manage resources. Their strength was their harmony. And harmony, once fractured, does not break loudly. It breaks slowly, almost imperceptibly, as pieces drift out of sync. A major twist emerges when the timeline of decline is compared to environmental data. Evidence of drought aligns with the period of contraction. Lake sediments show lower water levels, pollen samples shift toward drought-resistant plants. Rainfall patterns became erratic. At first glance, this appears to offer a clear explanation. But the deeper story resists simplicity. This civilization had survived earlier droughts of equal severity. Their diverse crops, sustainable practices, and flexible settlements made them resilient. Environmental change alone should not have undone them. This leads to a subtle but crucial realization. The drought did not cause the collapse. It revealed it. Earlier generations had faced climate challenges with cooperation and adaptability, but as communal life weakened, as rituals faded, as shared identity loosened, the structures that once allowed them to endure began to wobble. A drought that would once have been manageable became disruptive, not because the land changed radically, but because the society had already begun drifting apart. The narrator likens it to a rhythm that gradually loses its coherence. A drumbeat slowed, then staggered, until dancers found it hard to follow. People may have sensed this shift emotionally before they recognized it physically. Gatherings felt smaller, decisions felt harder, trust grew thin. Rituals that once united them became obligations rather than celebrations. The worldview that had sustained them, cycles, harmony, balance, began to feel strained in the face of uncertainty. There is tragedy in such a quiet ending. No dramatic ruins testify to final struggles. No charred cities mark a climactic battle. Instead, the archaeological record shows a civilization gently withdrawing from its own identity. Homes remained inhabited, even as plazas emptied. Tools were still made, even as quality waned. Life continued, but the coherence that once wove everything together loosened until it could no longer hold. Collapse, here, is not an explosion. It is a whisper, a long exhale, a silence slowly replacing a song. If unraveling was slow, almost dreamlike, then the next mystery grows sharper. What moment, what pressure, or realization finally pushed them to walk away entirely? When archaeologists first realized that entire settlements were abandoned without violence, the discovery felt incomprehensible. These towns were not destroyed, they were left behind with intention. Hearths were extinguished neatly, as though marking a final evening meal. Tools were arranged in quiet order, not scattered in haste. Storage vessels were emptied or sealed, suggesting closure rather than crisis. It was as if the inhabitants paused, took one last look at their homes, and then stepped away together. The absence of panic is its own form of message. As researchers pieced together the evidence, a picture formed of coordinated migration rather than chaotic flight. Paths leading outward from settlements show clustered footprints, preserved in hardened mud, families moving together. In some areas, gathering sites appear suddenly empty, the last fires carefully banked. If danger had forced them to flee, traces of disruption would remain. Instead, the archaeological silence feels ceremonial, almost ritualistic. The narrator offers several possibilities, each unsettling in its calmness. One theory suggests spiritual realignment, that a shift in belief or a new interpretation of their symbolic system encouraged them to seek a different landscape. For a civilization whose identity flowed through cycles and celestial patterns, perhaps a rare astronomical event or a generational revelation-inspired movement. Another possibility is the search for new land. Though resilient, their world was changing, and perhaps they believed harmony required relocation rather than struggle. But the most haunting explanation lies in the idea of symbolic ending. A society guided by cycles might have viewed departure as part of the natural rhythm, a closing of one era and the beginning of another. If their cooperation began to wane, if their rituals lost strength, if their world felt slightly out of tune, they may have interpreted the fading harmony as a sign that the time of these settlements had passed. Leaving may not have been seen as abandonment, but as continuation, a migration woven into the flow of their worldview. Then comes the major reveal. Identical abandonment patterns appear across settlements separated by hundreds of miles. The same extinguished hearths, the same neatly stored tools, the same absence of violence, the same impression of calm departure. Such coherence cannot be accidental. It implies shared ideology, an understanding transmitted across vast distances without edicts, without rulers, without messengers carved into stone. This realization reframes the collapse entirely. The people did not scatter in fear. They moved together with purpose, following a collective decision shaped by belief rather than coercion. This raises a provocative question. What could convince thousands to walk away willingly from homes their ancestors built? The narrator speaks almost in a whisper. What faith, what fear, what vision carries such power? In most ancient worlds, collapse is imposed by invaders, famine, or disease. But here, collapse may have unfolded as choice. The people may have recognized that the unity sustaining their civilization had weakened. Instead of clinging to structures that no longer held meaning, they released them. Instead of forcing continuity, they embraced change. The eerie part is that no new settlements definitively linked to them have been found. If they migrated, they left little trace. If they dissolved into neighboring cultures, they did so quietly. If they scattered intentionally, they carried only their memories. Their departure becomes not just an archaeological puzzle, but an emotional one. This was a society that built its world on balance. Perhaps when the balance shifted beyond reclamation, they simply stepped into the unknown, trusting the same rhythms that had guided them for centuries. The Great Departure is not a tragedy of destruction. It is a mystery of intention, a collective decision wrapped in silence. And after the people left, absence remained a silence that shaped how rediscoverers, centuries later, would interpret the faint footprints they left behind. Civilizations rarely vanish completely. Even when their buildings crumble and their names are forgotten, certain patterns linger, traces of memory carried forward by hands that never knew the origins of what they preserved. As researchers examined later cultures that lived in the same valleys, crossed the same rivers, and farmed the same soil, they began to notice echoes of the vanished world. These traces were faint, but they formed a subtle constellation of continuity. Motifs resembling the old spirals and stepped forms appear in pottery made centuries later. Not exact reproductions, but softened versions, filtered through time. Agricultural techniques, crop rotation, diversified planting, seasonal foraging mirror practices, reconstructed from the earlier civilization. Even settlement layouts in some regions show curious similarities. Courtyards aligned with wind patterns, communal structures near water sources, homes arranged with gentle uniformity. These choices may not have been conscious inheritances, but they reveal how deeply the earlier society shaped the land, and how the land, in turn, shaped those who followed. The narrator guides viewers through a quiet reflection. Sometimes a world survives not through ruins, but through rhythms. The echoes become clearest in seasonal rituals, light ceremonies marking solstices, dances, mimicking animal movements, gatherings timed to the first rains all appear in later communities. Scholars once assumed these practices developed independently, but as knowledge expanded, parallels between modern traditions and ancient archaeological patterns grew difficult to ignore. The most powerful twist emerges when anthropologists interviewed remote communities in regions once inhabited by this civilization. Elders described rituals involving mask-wearing during the changing seasons, communal dances performed without leaders, and songs that follow repetitive spiraling melodies. When shown reconstructions of artifacts from the vanished society, some responded with recognition not from scholarly knowledge, but from lived experience. "We do something like this," they said, unaware that their customs echoed a world thousands of years older. These communities did not retain the original meanings. They did not know the names of the ancestors who first danced beneath solstice sunrises or painted spirals onto communal platforms. But the gestures survived, preserved in practice rather than memory. Culture, it seems, disperses like seeds on the wind, taking root far from its source, sprouting in new contexts, adapting to new soils while carrying ancient patterns within. This diffusion challenges the idea of collapse as an ending. The narrator suggests a different perspective. Perhaps the civilization transformed rather than died. When people left their settlements, they may have blended into neighboring groups, carrying fragments of knowledge, songs, rituals, agricultural wisdom, and worldview. Over generations, those fragments became threads woven into new cultural fabrics. What we perceive as disappearance might be something softer, something more fluid, the world dissolving into others until its essence becomes part of a wider human story. Consider the persistence of their egalitarian spirit. Some later communities show unusual social balance, fewer signs of rigid hierarchy, and communal festivals where identity becomes shared rather than individualized. While these traits cannot be definitively traced back, the similarities provoke wonder. Ideas do not vanish simply because the structures that held them change shape. The narrator's voice slows, inviting viewers into the emotional core of the section. A civilization is not a single body, the voice says. It is a collection of gestures, choices, and beliefs passed quietly from hand to hand. Even when settlements turned to dust, those gestures remained. The old worldview cycles. Cooperation, humility, harmony did not vanish. It drifted into the cultures that followed, shape-shifting across centuries. The echoes also remind us that history is not a linear progression of triumph and collapse. Sometimes it is a tide that recedes and leaves patterns in the sand, patterns others later trace without knowing who drew them first. The vanished civilization may no longer stand in stone, but its influence pulses faintly beneath the surface of many traditions, like a heartbeat carried forward by generations unaware of its origin. With collapse explored and echoes traced, we now return to a final question. Why does this civilization matter today, and what can its quiet wisdom teach a modern world shaped by hierarchy, urgency, and noise? History is often taught as a ladder. Each rung holds a familiar idea. Power leads to order, hierarchy leads to stability, armies protect progress, and rulers shape destiny. But the civilization we have followed across these chapters stands quietly at the edge of that ladder and asks us to reconsider where it truly leads. They built cities without kings. They maintained order without armies. They shared abundance without elite oversight. Their world did not grow from conquest or domination, but from cooperation, ritual, and alignment with nature. And in doing so, they challenged the assumption that complexity must be commanded from above. As the narrator's voice settles into a contemplative rhythm, viewers feel the weight of this revelation. This society was not small, nor accidental, nor primitive. It was expansive, intricate, and resilient. Its architecture shows planning. Its diet shows forethought. Its symbols show shared meaning. Its cities span miles, yet nowhere in its ruins do we find the signatures of authority. No throne podiums, no tax records, no emblems of military hierarchy. The absence becomes a presence of its own, a reminder that humans have more ways to organize life than the ones history tends to celebrate. The narrator reflects softly. We believed power must be centralized. They lived as if power was something that flowed through everyone. Their existence widens the spectrum of what humans are capable of. It suggests that progress does not require dominance. It demonstrates that harmony is not a naive dream, but a model that once endured for centuries. This realization unsettles familiar narratives about how societies grow and why they fall. If they succeeded without rulers, what does that say about the stories we tell ourselves about civilization? Then comes the twist, woven gently into the script, like a subtle shift in wind direction. Modern societies resemble ancient ones more closely than we admit. Our hierarchies echo theirs, but so do our weaknesses. We inherit many assumptions from ancient powers. That competition drives innovation, that authority prevents chaos, that growth demands centralization. But we also inherit their fragility. When cooperation thins, when trust erodes, when shared purpose falters, even the strongest structures wobble. The silent unraveling of this civilization mirrors the quiet fractures seen in our own world, fractures that emerge not with sudden disaster, but with subtle drift. Their strengths echo today as well. Diverse diets sustained them. Diverse ideas sustain us. Shared rituals kept their identity intact. Shared values hold ours together. Their ability to adapt, to trust one another, to live within natural limits, stands as a reminder that resilience comes not from power, but from balance. They found meaning in cycles, not conquest. They located identity in community, not ambition. Their choices, made thousands of years ago, speak to challenges we face now. How to live without exhausting the world, how to maintain unity without force, how to preserve meaning when structures crumble. The narrator asks quietly, what if the future we fear has already been lived and solved by people with no kings? It is a question that stretches the imagination. We often imagine societal collapse as violent, chaotic, devastating, yet they faced environmental stress, social strain, dwindling participation, and still departed peacefully. Their world did not end in flames. It faded like embers settling into ash. And in that gentle ending lies another kind of lesson. Collapse can be a transition, not a failure. Change can be intentional, not imposed. A society can release what no longer serves it and step into the unknown without losing its humanity. Their existence forces us to rethink what counts as success. We measure civilizations by the monuments they leave, the wars they win, the kings they crown. But perhaps a more subtle measure exists. Did people live well? Did they trust one another? Did they build systems that sustained life rather than drained it? In those measures, this civilization surpasses many others. They found strength in equality, stability in cooperation, continuity in ritual, and purpose in the natural world. As the narrator's voice softens further, the section prepares for its final thought. To understand why their story matters, we must see ourselves reflected in them. Their rise, their harmony, their slow unraveling, and their departure all mirror patterns humanity continues to repeat. Their legacy is not in stones or artifacts, but in the questions they leave behind, questions about power, balance, identity, and resilience. With this reflection, the narrative pivots gently toward the next chapter. If their story challenges what we thought we knew, then perhaps the deeper lesson lies in what their world reveals about our own. As the documentary draws closer to its final chapters, the ancient world begins to resemble something startlingly familiar. The ruins we've walked through, the diets we've reconstructed, the rituals we've imagined, and the slow unraveling we've traced, each becomes a reflection held quietly against our present moment. The civilization that vanished without kings or armies begins to illuminate not just its own mysteries, but the challenges threading through modern life. Their story becomes a mirror, polished by centuries of silence, offering a glimpse of ourselves from a distance we rarely consider. The narrator moves gently through these parallels. Today, inequality stretches across nations, like widening cracks. Power concentrates in small circles. Social bonds strain beneath the weight of competition, anxiety, and noise. Environmental systems falter under human pressure. Each fracture echoes the vulnerabilities that this ancient civilization eventually faced, not through sudden catastrophe, but through slow erosion of shared purpose. They remind us that instability begins long before collapse, in the subtle fraying of trust and meaning. Yet their world also reveals alternatives, paths humanity once followed with quiet confidence. Their society, built on cooperation rather than dominance, thrived for centuries without creating sharp hierarchies. They organized their fields, homes, rituals, and relationships in ways that emphasized balance. They believed leadership was not a crown worn permanently, but a moment shared collectively in ritual or shared work. Their symbols belonged to everyone. Their food was distributed evenly. Their identity shifted fluidly, shaped by seasons rather than status. These practices challenge the assumption that inequality is inevitable, or that centralized authority is the only way to sustain order. The narrator pauses, letting the implication deepen. What if the answers we seek today were already lived out by a people we almost forgot? In their absence of rulers, we see a model of distributed responsibility. In their harmony with nature, we see a guide for sustainable living. In their inclusive rituals, we see a way to restore community. Their wisdom was not bound to texts or doctrines. It was embedded in daily life, enacted through movement, shared through story, preserved through cooperation. Modern societies struggle with questions that feel impossibly large. How do we create stability without oppression? How do we share resources without conflict? How do we maintain identity without division? How do we live within the limits of our environment while still flourishing? These people face similar challenges, not through conquest or power, but through a worldview woven from humility, observation, and reciprocity. Their solutions were not dramatic. They were quiet, subtle, embodied. And because they were lived rather than written, they almost slipped entirely from memory. Their disappearance, too, holds a lesson. They did not fall by war or conquest. They did not leave behind monuments demanding remembrance. Instead, they stepped into silence, diffused into other cultures, leaving echoes rather than empires. Their ending was gentle but instructive. Societies do not break only through violence. They fade when the bonds that sustain them loosen. And yet, even as they dissolved, parts of their worldview survived, carried unknowingly by later communities, shaping practices that endure to this day. The emotional heart of this section lies in the recognition that the forgotten can still guide the living. Their story does not offer a blueprint, but it offers possibility. It invites the viewer to imagine futures that do not rely on the structures we assume are necessary. Futures where cooperation holds greater power than conquest, where identity emerges from shared purpose rather than competition, where the environment is not an obstacle but a partner. The narrator ends on a note of quiet reflection. When we look at them, we see ourselves not in their tools or their houses, but in their hopes, their fears, their choices. The mirror they hold does not reflect perfection, it reflects potential. A civilization that thrived without kings asks us to reconsider what we truly need in order to endure. With this introspective moment, the documentary begins to close its narrative circle. And now, having seen their world and ours entwine, we move toward the final question. What do these echoes mean for the future we are choosing to build? Silence is often mistaken for absence, but in archaeology and in life, it can hold more meaning than words ever could. The civilization we've followed across this documentary left us no written tablets, no carved histories, no records claiming triumph or tragedy. Their story arrives instead through broken pottery, worn pathways, layers of abandoned hearths, and bones whispering of peaceful lives. Their world asks us to listen differently. It asks us to see knowledge, not as something they failed to leave behind, but as something we must learn to approach with humility. The narrator's voice softens, creating space for viewers to breathe. When a people choose not to write, what becomes their legacy? In the quiet that follows, we realize the question is not about loss, but about perspective. Written languages crystallize ideas, freezing them in a moment, but unwritten worlds flow. They transform with every generation, carried through ritual, gesture, memory, and song. Their silence forces us to reconstruct meaning slowly, patiently, respectfully, aware that our interpretations may never be complete. And perhaps that incompleteness is the true gift. As researchers sifted through debris, they realized how fragile certainty becomes when text is absent. They could not rely on inscriptions to declare who ruled, who fought, who suffered, who prospered. Instead, they had to read subtler signs. The uniformity of houses hinting at equality, the absence of battle scars revealing peace, the diversity of crops suggesting resilience, the alignment of buildings pointing toward a cosmology shaped by cycles. Silence compelled them to look at what remained, not what was proclaimed. It turned archaeology into empathy. The narrator describes how silence becomes invitation. Gaps in the record ask us to imagine how people understood themselves, how they moved through landscapes, how they negotiated meaning without central authority. Instead of telling us everything, this civilization lets us wonder. Their world does not restrict us to a single narrative. It opens the possibility of many. Viewers find themselves contemplating not only what these people believed, but what we believe about civilization, progress, and purpose. Silence also invites introspection. In the quiet spaces where text should be, we encounter ourselves, our assumptions, our hopes, our fears. We project onto the past the futures we desire or dread. This society becomes a canvas where modern anxieties about hierarchy, conflict, climate, and identity take shape. Their silence allows us to see those patterns. Their absence of kings lets us question our attachment to leadership. Their harmony with nature asks us to reconsider how we treat the world. Their slow unraveling reminds us that fragility often appears not as crisis, but as the soft erosion of the things that bind us together. Midway through the section, the narrator offers a gentle revelation. Silence is not the lack of a story. It is a different way of telling one. Their world communicated through symbols scattered across communal spaces, through dances that blurred the boundaries between individuals, through rituals that renewed the bond between people and land. Writing, in many civilizations, separated memory from the body. But here, memory lived through movement, sound, and presence. Their silence teaches us that meaning does not require inscription. It requires participation. This meditative space becomes an emotional pause, a moment to absorb the full journey, from their emergence to their disappearance, from their cooperation to their quiet departure, Everything we know about them arises from fragments interpreted with care. And because their story is incomplete, it remains alive. It changes as we change. Their silence continues to shape understanding, not through finality, but through openness. As the narrator prepares viewers for the final chapters, the tone shifts gently toward reflection. What wisdom lives in the things they never said? Perhaps the wisdom is not a message they intended for us, but a lesson we uncover by walking through the ruins they left behind. Their silence encourages humility. It reminds us that knowledge is partial, that certainty can be misleading, that the past is not a fixed truth but a shared act of interpretation. With this recognition, the narrative moves toward its final arc, where mystery softens into meaning, and the story of a vanished people becomes a meditation on what it means to endure, to remember, and to imagine new futures shaped by forgotten worlds. Even after decades of excavation, analysis, and debate, the landscape of this lost civilization remains filled with puzzles that refuse to resolve. Some mysteries whisper from beneath collapsed walls, others gleam faintly in symbols carved into stone. Still, others lie in the empty spaces between settlements, where paths fade into silence. These unresolved clues shape our understanding as much as the discoveries themselves. They remind us that the past is not a closed book, but a shifting constellation of questions we learn to navigate rather than answer. The narrator begins by guiding viewers through a series of enigmatic structures unearthed on the outskirts of several ruins. These buildings do not fit the typical domestic, ceremonial, or agricultural patterns seen elsewhere in the region. Their walls form unusual angles, their floors rise and fall in unexpected tiers, and their entrances appear oriented toward the horizon in ways that do not match solstice or equinox alignments. Some believe these spaces served as astronomical observatories. Others propose they may have been transitional zones, places where travelers rested or communities renewed their collective identity. But the truth remains elusive. Archaeologists can map every stone, yet still not understand the purpose behind the design. Unknown symbols present another layer of mystery. While the primary motifs, spirals, waves, animal shapes appear broadly shared, a handful of rare markings surface only in remote sites. These symbols seem to belong to a different visual vocabulary, as if representing ideas too specialized or sacred to be widely repeated. The narrator leans gently into the uncertainty. Are these signs messages left for wanderers, markers of boundary or belonging, or fragments of stories that slipped from memory before they were ever written down? Each interpretation creates possibilities, but none settle into certainty. Then there are the gaps, those long stretches of landscape between settlements, where traces of movement should exist but do not. If these towns were connected across such vast distances, why do we find so few intermediate sites? Why are the paths so faint, the transitions so quiet? Some researchers suggest that the people traveled lightly, leaving minimal imprint on the land. Others argue that many smaller sites remain undiscovered, hidden under forests, farms, or rivers that changed course over centuries. But another theory, whispered cautiously, suggests that movement itself may have been symbolic, that journeys followed routes erased intentionally during abandonment, leaving only the destinations as anchors in the archaeological record. As the narrator lingers on these riddles, the tone deepens. Mystery grows, not from lack of evidence, the voice says, but from the presence of clues that refuse to align. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the midsection twist. Every year, new discoveries emerge, structures previously unknown, symbols that challenge established interpretations, layers of occupation that redraw timelines. Far from solving the puzzle, each new finding expands it, revealing greater complexity rather than clarity. Instead of bringing us closer to a single narrative, the evidence pulls us into a labyrinth of overlapping possibilities. Recent digs uncovered a series of low, circular platforms whose surfaces bear tiny depressions, arranged in patterns that resemble star maps, yet the configurations match no known constellations. Another excavation revealed a cluster of homes with unusually thick walls, suggesting either a unique microclimate or a cultural practice not seen elsewhere. Still, another site yielded an artifact crafted from a stone found hundreds of kilometers away, hinting at connections far beyond the region we once believed contained this civilization. With each revelation, certainty slips further away. The narrator acknowledges this with quiet admiration. What if the more we discover, the voice wonders, the less we truly understand? This civilization seems intent on resisting closure, Its clues offer glimpses, not answers. Its structures evoke purpose without revealing function. Its symbols communicate presence without meaning. This ambiguity forces modern minds trained to categorize, to solve, to define, to sit with incompleteness. Yet this lack of resolution is not failure, it is invitation, an open door into imagination and humility. These unsolved puzzles teach us that human history is not a solved equation, but an unfolding story, one where missing pieces encourage curiosity, not frustration. They remind us that some worlds were not meant to be understood entirely through excavation, measurement, and analysis. Some worlds ask us to approach with wonder, accepting that interpretation is always partial. And so the section closes not with an answer, but with a widening horizon. The clues we cannot read form the threshold to a deeper question, not about what these people did, but what their mysteries inspire in us. From these unresolved fragments, we now move toward the meanings we draw from them, and what their silence reveals about our own search for understanding. Every ancient mystery comes to us through a filter: our own curiosity, our own assumptions, our own longing to understand. The evidence left behind by this vanished civilization is real. The stones, the tools, the bones, the symbols. But the meaning we give those fragments is shaped as much by the questions we ask as by the answers the past provides. The narrator invites viewers to settle into this idea, to feel how interpretation becomes an art as much as a science. Archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists often disagree not because the evidence is unclear, but because the lens through which they view the evidence differs. One researcher might see communal plazas and imagine a society guided by ritual harmony. Another might see the same plaza and envision political meetings or seasonal markets. A third might emphasize the absence of hierarchy as proof of deep social equality, while a fourth suggests the possibility of informal leadership that simply left no trace. None of these readings are wrong. Each one reveals something about the interpreter as much as about the people being studied. The narrator explains that meaning is shaped not only by what we uncover, but by what we hope to find. Scholars who seek examples of peaceful ancient societies highlight cooperation and shared identity. Those who study political theory look for evidence of decentralized governance. Those fascinated by cosmology focus on celestial alignments, and those skeptical of idealized narratives examine the slow unraveling and departure as cautionary tales about social fragility. The past becomes a mirror reflecting the desires, fears, and values of those who gaze into it. This becomes especially clear in debates about the civilization's collapse. Some interpret the slow fading of craftsmanship and rituals as symptoms of environmental strain. Others see them as internal fractures, signs that belief systems weakened over time. Still others propose that the Great Departure was a purposeful, symbolic act, rather than collapse at all. Each interpretation reshapes the emotional landscape of the story. A tragedy for one scholar becomes an act of renewal for another. A mystery for one becomes a warning for another. Meaning drifts depending on who we are when we approach the ruins. The narrator pauses here, allowing viewers to feel the emotional weight behind these interpretations. Ancient mysteries draw us not only because they are unsolved, but because they allow us to participate in the act of imagining. We project lessons, create parallels, trace possibilities. In doing so, we reveal our own hopes, that cooperation is possible, that balance with nature is sustainable, that collapse can be peaceful, that identity can be fluid, that societies can thrive without domination. Whether or not these interpretations reflect the ancient truth, they reflect our modern yearning to understand ourselves. There is a quiet beauty in this. History, the narrator says, is not a fixed answer carved into stone. It is a dialogue, one that shifts with time, with perspective, with the evolving understanding of each new generation. What we think we know today may change tomorrow when a new artifact emerges, or when we learn to ask a better question. This civilization, in its silence, invites us into that dialogue. It refuses to declare one narrative, leaving open space for interpretation, imagination, and humility. This openness can feel unsettling. We long for certainty. We want to know what the symbols meant, why the settlements were abandoned, what beliefs carried the people through centuries of harmony. But uncertainty is part of the story. The questions we ask reveal who we are as much as what they were. The gaps remind us that knowledge is always partial, that understanding is always unfolding. As the narrator prepares to guide viewers into the final chapters, the tone deepens. What if the story we tell, the voice asks softly, says more about us than about them? It is a question that turns the documentary inward, transforming an archaeological mystery into a meditation on human nature and the stories we choose to craft. With this reflective pause, the narrative shifts toward its closing arc. A space where mystery becomes meaning, and where the vanished civilization's silence echoes into our present and our future. There are landscapes where silence feels almost deliberate, where wind brushes through grass with the gentleness of a memory, and stones lie arranged not by chance, but as if waiting to be remembered. The world of this vanished civilization carries that kind of quiet. When the narrator returns us to these plains, to the river valleys and open courtyards and distant mountain silhouettes, the ruins appear less like abandoned structures and more like echoes, soft returns of a world that still hums beneath the surface of our own. We revisit the settlements not as archaeologists cataloguing fragments, but as listeners tracing a fading melody. The foundations of their homes, worn by centuries of sun and rain, form patterns that resemble footprints, a choreography of daily life long after the dancers themselves slipped into obscurity. Tools left behind retain the warmth of hands that shaped them. Masks, cracked and faded, still seem prepared for the moment when twilight gathers a crowd and music begins. Their spirals, waves, and celestial motifs shimmer faintly as if trying to remember what they once meant. The narrator suggests softly that civilizations do not truly disappear. They dissolve into the world that follows, carried in the habits of strangers, in the curve of a symbol adapted unknowingly, in the structure of a settlement built with echoes of an older logic. Memory does not require writing. It can survive in the angles of walls, in the rhythms of agriculture, in rituals transformed by centuries yet still answering to the same ancient pulse. Even silence can preserve a story, when enough of us choose to listen. The tools of their daily life offer such whispers. A grinding stone, smoothed from years of use, becomes a small monument to patience. A pot shaped with familiar curves becomes a quiet reminder that beauty was once shared equally. The way they placed their hearths, how they aligned their courtyards with wind and light, how they allowed nature to guide their sense of time, all of these choices continue to ripple outward, long after the people themselves stepped away. Their worldview persists not as doctrine, but as influence. Rituals leave echoes too. When modern communities gather in circles to mark the passing of seasons, when dances blur individual identity into something collective, when firelight turns faces into shifting silhouettes, the resemblance is undeniable. These echoes were not consciously preserved. They survived because they answered a human need older than writing. A need to belong, to celebrate, to remember without words. We carry fragments of their world without knowing that we carry them. Back in the ruins, the narrator reflects on how strange it is that traces of a vanished society can feel more alive than monuments from empires with names carved into every stone. Perhaps it is because this civilization lived not by declaring itself, but by existing in harmony with what surrounded it. Their silence does not feel like absence. It feels like a breath still hanging in the air, like a story waiting to be completed by those willing to approach gently. Even the collapse, revisited from this vantage, becomes part of the echo. Their slow unraveling, their peaceful departure, their migration into uncertainty, all resonate with themes that echo today. How societies adapt, how they falter, how they choose to move forward. In their disappearance lies a lesson about resilience and its limits, about unity and its fragility, about the choices people make when the world grows unfamiliar. What if the civilization never vanished, only changed form? The narrator asks, letting the words drift into the long quiet of evening. Perhaps they survive in the landscapes they shaped, in the cultural traces they left, in the questions they inspired, and in the reflections they stirred in those who rediscovered them millennia later. Their presence lingers because they approached life in a way that resonates across centuries, offering possibilities we rarely consider. And so the echoes gather, forming not an ending but an invitation, a whisper guiding us toward the final chapter, where mystery softens into reflection, and where the past leans forward, asking us what we will do with the world we have inherited. There are places in the world where time feels thinner, where the boundary between the present and the past stretches like a quiet thread. As the narrator returns us to the ruins of this lost civilization, open plazas scoured by wind, stone foundations softened by moss, courtyards where silence feels almost ceremonial, we begin to sense that these landscapes are not empty. They are listening. They are waiting. They hold memories that have not fully dissolved. Standing among these remnants, the viewer is no longer just an observer, but a participant in a story still unfolding. The shapes of the old walls suggest the rhythm of lives once lived inside them. Footpaths, now overgrown, curve toward vanished doorways, inviting imagination to follow their faint lines. Even the air seems to carry a trace of the world that once flourished here. A world where cooperation shaped every gesture, and where the absence of rulers did not signify chaos, but confidence in shared purpose. The narrator speaks softly, as if afraid to disturb the breath of the land. We stand at the edge of their memory, the voice says, not to solve them, but to understand ourselves. The ruins become mirrors. Every unanswered question reflects a possibility about human nature. Every missing inscription becomes an invitation to reconsider what is essential. These people left no proclamations, no carved histories, no monuments celebrating power, and yet their legacy endures precisely because it was never written. It is felt rather than stated, sensed rather than decoded. A twist emerges gently, like a stone surfacing beneath clear water. The greatest clue they left us may not be hidden in artifacts or symbols, but in the simple truth of their existence. A complex society thrived here for centuries without kings, without armies, without wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. They created beauty without oppression, stability without conquest, identity without hierarchy. That this was possible is itself a revelation, and perhaps the most challenging idea they ask us to face. The narrator guides the audience deeper into this realization. We have been taught to assume that order must be enforced, that progress demands authority, that civilization grows through conflict and control. But as we stand among these quiet structures, those assumptions begin to loosen. Here is evidence of another path, one rarely taught and almost forgotten. The wind threads through the courtyards like a reminder. Humanity once built a world on different foundations. What truth about ourselves becomes visible when we stand in the places they left behind? The narrator asks, letting the question drift across broken terraces and into the open sky. Perhaps the truth is that cooperation runs deeper than conflict. Perhaps the truth is that identity can arise from belonging, not from domination. Perhaps the truth is that societies need not always choose between order and freedom. The ruins whisper that the choices shaping our future are not bound by the past we think we know, but by the past we are willing to imagine differently. As the camera follows the narrator through sunlit corridors and shadowed halls, we sense that the ruins are not just remnants, they are reminders. They remind us that absence does not mean failure. They remind us that silence can hold wisdom. They remind us that civilizations do not need to carve their triumphs into stone to shape the world that follows. Sometimes influence moves quietly, carried forward in ideas, stories, rituals, and instincts that survive the extinction of names. The narrator pauses at the edge of an old communal platform. Grass sways where people once gathered to celebrate, to mourn, to decide, to dream. In this stillness, the viewer is invited to feel the continuity between their lives and ours, not in technology or architecture, but in the yearning for belonging, meaning, and stability. We inherit not their structures, but their questions. This first step into the final chapter becomes a moment of quiet transformation. The story shifts from archaeology to introspection, from fragments to understanding. We begin to see that their memory does not lie in what they left, but in what they suggest is possible. And with that realization, the narrative drifts forward toward the legacy they never intended but somehow gifted, the silent message carried across centuries to those willing to listen. When we look back across the centuries at this civilization that rose gently and faded quietly, we do more than study a vanished world. We hold up a lantern to our own. Their way of life built on cooperation rather than domination, on shared identity rather than hierarchy, on balance with the land rather than conquest of it, offers lessons that feel almost whispered through time. They remind us that human societies do not have to follow a single script. They show that flourishing is possible without placing power in the hands of a few. They reveal that peace is not the absence of ambition, but the presence of trust. As the narrator's voice settles into a contemplative tone, the ruins come alive with meaning. Their settlements, aligned with seasons and rivers, demonstrate a relationship with nature that was not ownership, but partnership. They understood cycles better than we do. They knew that prosperity carries responsibility, and that abundance requires restraint. In a world now wrestling with environmental strain, their harmony becomes not an artifact but a lesson an ancient reminder that sustainability does not begin with technology, but with mindset. Cooperation was not an ideal for them. It was a necessity woven into the structure of daily life. Their shared courtyards, communal rituals, fluid identities, and evenly distributed resources suggest a society that valued contribution over competition. They remind us that equality is not naive, nor is it impossible at scale. They lived proof that a civilization can grow through shared purpose rather than hierarchy. And yet their story is not simply a celebration of strengths. Their collapse, slow, subtle, almost sorrowful, teaches us about fragility. It warns us that even the most balanced systems can unravel when participation fades. They survived droughts before, but not the diminishment of communal rhythm. Their departure is a testament to how delicate social cohesion can be. It cautions us that resilience must be renewed continuously, not assumed. This interplay between their success and their decline becomes the heart of the section. A quiet, meditative reminder that the systems we build must be nurtured. If cooperation is the foundation, then connection is its maintenance. If equality is the structure, then participation is its lifeblood. Their world teaches us that collapse rarely begins with catastrophe. It begins when the shared threads that hold a people together loosen. The narrator guides viewers into a more intimate reflection. What if their lost world is actually a map to a different future? The voice asks. Not as speculation, but as invitation. Their story challenges the inevitability of our assumptions. It suggests that complexity can emerge without hierarchy, that identity can be fluid without chaos, that peace can endure without dominance. Their solutions arose from observation, ritual, and cooperation, not from decree or coercion. And perhaps that is why they resonate so deeply today. They show another way of being human. Their disappearance, too, offers insight. They did not fall into violence. They did not fracture through war. They chose, in their final chapter, to depart together. This collective decision, whatever its cause, reminds us that endings can be intentional, not destructive. That change can be embraced, not feared. That societies can release what no longer serves them and carry forward the essence of their identity in new forms. As modern viewers, we stand at a crossroads they could never have imagined. Our technologies expand faster than our understanding. Our networks grow even as our communities shrink. Our ambitions outrun the Earth's rhythms. Yet their story, told through ruins and silence, offers a compass. It does not tell us what direction to walk, but it shows that more directions exist than the ones we currently see. By learning from them, we do not resurrect their world. We illuminate our own. Their civilization may have slipped from the landscape, but it remains present in the questions we now ask about sustainability, equality, cooperation, and purpose. It lives on in the choices we make, the systems we build, and the futures we imagine. With these lessons lingering like echoes across the centuries, the documentary prepares for its final reflection, where memory, mystery, and meaning converge into a single, quiet, closing whisper. History moves like water. It arrives with force, settles into patterns, reshapes the land, and slowly retreats, never fully gone, never fully still. As the narrator guides us through this final reflection, the ruins of the vanished civilization seem to rise and fall with that rhythm. Their plazas become tides, their courtyards become ripples. Their silence becomes the soft pull of memory across an ancient shore. We stand on the edge of their world, watching the tide of time ebb and flow, carrying their story outward into the vastness of human imagination. This closing chapter does not seek answers. Instead, it gathers the threads of everything we have explored, the cooperation that bound them, the symbols that guided them, the rituals that shaped them, the landscapes that held them, the mysteries that surround them. It weaves these into a final tapestry of quiet wonder. The narrator invites us to see their civilization not as a puzzle to solve, but as a voice that never raised itself above a whisper, yet still manages to echo across millennia. Their story becomes a mirror, a lesson, a possibility. It reminds us that human societies are not fixed structures but creative acts, fluid, experimental, ever-changing. They built a world without kings, without armies, without monumental declarations of power, and yet they endured for centuries. This alone is a revelation, a gesture toward futures we rarely allow ourselves to imagine. Perhaps their greatest achievement was not the cities they constructed or the rituals they performed, but the space they left behind. a gap in the historical record that invites us to question what is necessary and what is optional in the making of a civilization. The narrator asks softly, "What if the greatest civilizations are the ones that leave us questions instead of answers?" It is a question that deepens rather than resolves. Their absence of hierarchy reveals that power is not inevitable. Their harmony with nature reveals that sustainability is not a modern invention but an ancient wisdom. Their slow unraveling reveals that fragility belongs to all forms of human organization, even the peaceful ones. And their disappearance, quiet as dusk settling over a field, reminds us that endings need not be violent to be profound. Their legacy is not carved in stone. It is carried in possibility. It takes shape in the way we imagine the future. It lingers in how we rethink community, balance, cooperation, and meaning. Their silence encourages us to participate in the telling of the story, to fill the empty spaces with our own interpretations, hopes, and questions. In that way, their world becomes a collaborative creation, unfinished, open, alive. As the narrator's voice drifts through the final scenes, the camera returns once more to the landscapes that cradled their civilization. Evening light settles across empty plazas. River water glimmers between reeds. Winds curl around weathered stones as if tracing invisible patterns. Everything feels both ancient and immediate, as though the past is breathing gently against the present. Their memory floats in the air like a faint, familiar melody. The story closes, not with revelation, but with invitation. We are asked to carry their lessons forward, to imagine societies shaped by cooperation rather than domination, to value balance over conquest, to approach nature as teacher rather than resource, to hold community as a shared responsibility. Their world may have dissolved into the currents of time, but its echo runs through every question we ask about how to live well, how to honor connection, how to build something that endures beyond ourselves. The tide withdraws slowly, leaving behind a shimmering trace of everything we have seen. The documentary fades the way their civilization did, not abruptly, but gently, with a sense of breath still lingering. As the screen darkens, the narrator offers one final whisper. Their mystery continues, not in the ruins, but in the minds of those who pause long enough to wonder. And with that, the tide pulls back, carrying their story forward into us.